I'm doing a talk about the Flexbox Holy Albatross, which is it's a weird name. I come up with weird names because I'm one of those guys who tediously thinks they're really zany and kooky and all of that. And it's probably best for me to just like break it down into its constituent parts so you can understand what I'm on about. So first of all, Flexbox, which is not to be confused with Sexbox, which is a British television program. I did my research about this. I knew I was going to forget this. Hang on, I'm going to look up what it says. British television program. Just going to go into Samsung Notes here. Samsung Notes, really good for making notes if you want to do that sort of thing. British television program, Sexbox, a television program about people having sex in a box. So there you go. That's what it was all about. British culture is fucked, as recent history has obviously shown. So this is the kind of bilge that we pump out into Europe. You won't have to deal with that anymore, obviously. So the second part is Holy, short for Holy Grail, because I had in mind this kind of CSS layout that I wanted to achieve, and I thought, well, I can probably achieve it with Flexbox, but at the moment I don't know how. And if I did, it would be kind of cool. So it became this thing of great value that I really wanted to find, and I wanted to find it before other people. If you've ever seen the film The Last Crusade, Indiana Jones is literally looking for the Holy Grail, and he wants to find the Holy Grail before a group of people who we don't like very much found it. So basically we don't want our CSS layouts to fall into the hands of those very bad people. And finally, the albatross part here. Like, maybe we could actually do a bit of a call and answer that. Maybe turn it up a bit if you can. So if I say albatross and then you repeat back albatross.
Albatross! Albatross!
That was a complete waste of time, wasn't it? Really.
Albatross!
Oh shit! Right. Thank you. No, that was a mistake. So the albatross part is an allusion to a rap by a famous rapper called Sammy C, full name Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he wrote this rap called The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. You can tell he's a rapper because he's playfully misspelled the word rhyme there. So the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, what happens is there's a mariner and he wears an albatross around his neck and the albatross represents like a psychological burden, like a deep regret. And it was with deep regret that I spent actually on and off months trying to figure out how to do this singular CSS layout. But now I've sorted it, hence the talk, otherwise this would be a bit of a letdown. So, on the agenda today, first up, what the fuck are you on about, Heydon? That's the first item on the agenda. A fair question. I welcome that question. I like that kind of inquiry. That's good. Good to have an inquisitive mind, etc., etc. Another inspirational speak. Second is, okay, that sounds quite good. Actually, open parenthesis. Sorry for swearing at you, close parenthesis. That's fine. I'd take your apology. It's better to make value judgments based on what you believe is right and sometimes be wrong than to sit on the fence. And third, web components. Why not, really? Because web components are actually nearly universally supported now, especially when Chromium comes along like a snake and sort of eats Edge like an egg and crushes it inside its stomach. And then basically all of the modern browsers will support web components, which will be great. And then fourth is things that suck ass. So look forward to that coming up soon. A little bit about me. My name is Heydon. If you're a recruiter, that's how my name is spelt. So you should know this because when you send me unsolicited emails, it's spelt correctly twice in the fucking email address itself. Okay, so I get a lot of emails which say, "Dear Heydon, would you like to do the front end for a React app that helps Russian spies trade Bitcoin or whatever?" And I say, "No, thank you very much. Lots of love. Kiss, kiss, kiss. Heydon." So, yeah. I don't have an inspirational story because I'm a white English-speaking man born into privilege. So I'm just going to cover the basics very quickly. Thanks. I feel weird. I mean, I'm already a very comfortable person. So, I eat quite a lot of rice. I don't tend to eat potato. I eat rice probably 6-7 times a week, I would say, something like that, interspersed with, oats and what have you. Actually, a source of protein. So, if you want to try and wean yourself off meat, it's a good thing to eat rice. I own one of these. This is a bat. And I'm wearing shorts. Like the whole conference, people have been coming up to me and saying, "You're wearing shorts." And I'm like, fuck me. You're right. I am wearing shorts. Oh, shit, no, I put these on earlier. So I am wearing shorts, so thank you for observing that. This is my favorite Pokemon. I don't know what his name is. I just call him Carl. So before I move on to the actual content of the talk, I think it's probably let's have a moment to reflect on all of that really inspiring kind of my tale of triumphing over adversity, little weep. Okay, I think there's enough time for that. Right, so on to the problem. The problem is this. Okay, so there's nice stuff with Flexbox. The nicest thing about Flexbox is you just have the Flexbox parent element has display flex, and then magically all of the child elements, the flex children, the children of the flex, or however you want to say it, they just like lay out like that, right? I mean, you can adapt them and change them and move them around in other ways, but it's kind of cool that it automatically does this thing, which was bizarrely really difficult to do for the longest amount of time. I've been arranging boxes inside boxes for 15 years now. Just arranging boxes inside boxes, and finally this came along. What's also neat is then if you put flex wrap, then if there's not enough room for all three things to be along one line, one will wrap round. And then if you do flex grow one, which is essentially let it grow, then it'll fill up the available space and you won't get any unsightly gaps, right? That's kind of neat. And eventually, of course, it turns into a hamburger button, which we don't want. But no, what I mean is then it turns into a single column because there's only enough room for one thing per line. That's really cool because it sort of governs the layout and does the grid stuff for you. You don't have to worry about breakpoints and things like that. And the problem, though, is that this intermediary stage, this layout, is not necessarily very desirable all the time. And it's because of the way people perceive things based on their shape and size and their position. So if there were three things which should be considered as being similar, but one of them is larger, your audience might look at that and think, why have they picked that out? Why are they concentrating on that? Is there something special about it? Is it more important? So it'd be kind of cool to bypass that intermediary stage and have a layout which magically just went from horizontal, everything in a horizontal line, to everything in a vertical line. And what people tell me is they say, use a breakpoint, Heydon. And they will DM me, they will stop me in the street, and they will break into my house and put passive-aggressive notes on my refrigerator door, send me Slack messages which go, dancing parrot, use a fucking breakpoint, Heydon, dancing parrot, that sort of thing all the time. And I say no, and there's two very good reasons for that. The first reason is actually genealogical. Kind of surprising, right? But what I did is I did some research into my ancestry. And I traced my family tree back just one level. And what I discovered is, not to put too fine a point on it, you're not my dad, you're not my dad, you're not my dad. Papa? Psych! You're not my dad, you're not my dad, and you're not my dad. But more to the point, more pertinently, media queries are a hack, and let me explain why. It's because I create my components, my layouts in my design system, because it's a design system. We develop these things in isolation, and we want to reuse these things because our whole point of a design system is to be more efficient with what we create, right? And they will be dropped into different contexts. And they might be dropped into a page where they are allowed to take up most of the viewport, or perhaps all the viewport minus padding. Or they might be dropped into a more constrained, I'm going with the theme there, the constraint thing, area where obviously they're going to not have enough space, or they might not have enough space. And even though we can rearrange things with media queries, we can only do that in terms of the viewport. It's always the same. It doesn't matter what container they appear in. The viewport is all that the media queries can deal in. So we'll get to this point where we can switch, but then those ones on the right will have been allowed to get narrow and squashed up at that point. So let's put it this way. What we want is to lay things out according to available space. What media queries help us with is not that. So there you go. So then people started talking about container queries. Actually, what we kind of want is container queries, because then we can let our individual components, our individual layout primitives, if you like, kind of self-govern and adapt to their immediate context. And that's kind of what container queries maybe would have looked like if they were developed into a mature spec. Unfortunately, now I don't know the technical details, but basically, when you try and feed the container queries concept into browsers, browsers go like this. It's like trying to feed someone Brussels sprouts. Essentially. So it's something to do with performance or something, or legacy something. Don't know the details, but basically container queries, that's a difficult problem. So what we do is we use something called Jenga script, also known as ExmaScript. And what Jenga script, it's called Jenga script because of the way it handles minor errors. Basically, so if you have a line in CSS which goes wrong, like the rest of the style sheet just passes, right? But if in Jenga script, everything just falls over, it's just a massive car crash, which is why it's such a popular language. This is my implementation of a container query in Jenga script. Uses resize observer, only supported currently in Chrome. And what it does basically is it keeps track of the width of a container that I tell it to, an element that I tell it to, and it will add and remove classes which would describe whether it's below or above certain widths. And in my particular implementation, because I like to do media queries, but now I'm doing container queries using units like ems and rems and ch and stuff like that, I do this little bit of stuff here where it translates between those units and pixels, because resize observer deals in pixels. So I put a little test element in there, I measure its offset width when it first mounts, and then I go from there. So that's kind of cool, but it's JavaScript, so not so great. Pure CSS container queries, are they possible? Yeah, kind of they are in a very restricted sense, and that's kind of what the Flexbox Holy Albatross is all about. What we need to do, though, is we need to work out how we do this direct switch between this layout and this layout. So something's got to happen there, some sort of event. Unfortunately, CSS is not an event-based language, and it doesn't deal in Booleans, so we can't just simply say switch from one place to another. But it kind of does deal in Booleans. You can sort of make it deal in Booleans, or what I call Booleans. Fake Booleans, I guess. And so take a look at this code. This is sort of how it could work. So I've got 3 custom properties at the top there. I've got border thin 2 pix. I've got border thick 0.25 rem. I've got border on 1. That's the key one. And that's a multiplier. I enter it into these calculations here. So this is how it works. N, whatever value it is, times 0 equals 0. And n times 1 equals n. It's like the n is passed through. It's like just sort of the return value. So that's kind of like an on and an off, a black and a white, or whatever you want to call it. So then if I was to, somewhere in the cascade, create a no borders class and make border on 0, then it's entered into the calculation. And then both of my borders there, despite being different widths, are both simultaneously turned off, if you like. So it kind of manages everything at once. It is like a hard switch, almost like a Boolean. So I think a multiplier thing is kind of what I want in the middle here for my Flexbox thing to work. That was like my hunch. And I apologize for the placement of the right-hand arrow in that picture. So what have we got? We've got a parent element, and that has a variable width. We don't know how wide it's going to be at the time of creating the component that it will be placed in. That's always going to be indeterminate. Then we have a constant, which is, let's say, 50 rem. So that's our container-based breakpoint, not an app media breakpoint, but a container-based breakpoint, okay? And the variable thing is either going to be wider or it's going to be narrower than this constant. So it's either wider, one thing, or narrower, the other thing. Again, almost sort of like dealing in like on and off, or like with Booleans. And the cool thing is you can always express the width of this container as 100%. Whether it's narrow or wide, it can always be said to be 100% of its own width, right? Which is kind of a tautology, but it's useful because I can enter it into this calculation here. So calc 50 rem minus 100%. And that's either, depending on whether it's wider or narrower than our breakpoint, going to come out as a positive or a negative number. So again, kind of like a hard switch. Now, at this point, I kind of thought I was onto something, but then I kind of lost inspiration. And this is when I sort of, every time I went to bed at night and I lay down, it kind of bothered me, and I was trying to think about how it would work, and then I go, oh no, of course, oh no, that won't work, etc., etc. In this situation, what the rapper Samuel Taylor Coleridge did to help inspire him, he did a particular thing. I'm wondering if anyone in the audience would be able to tell me what that was. He took drugs. He took a fuck ton of drugs. So I took a leaf out of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's book, but I am a sort of a boring, sort of beige, white middle-class person, so I didn't take drugs. I took the arbitrarily socially acceptable equivalent, which was Stay Puft Marshmallow Porter by the brewery Tiny Rebel. And I drank about 5 or 6 cans of these, went to bed, woke up feeling really kind of like with a swimming head, like feeling really out of it. And then it's in that weird state, that hangover state, that sometimes you get inspiration. And I suddenly thought, max width beats width. So if I set a max width on an element and I set a width that's higher than that max width will go, nope, we're going to stay at this level. We're going to stick to the max width. And it works the other way as well. Min width beats width too. So if you have the lowest possible width, if you set the width lower than that, then min width is kind of what's returned in JavaScript terms. So that allowed me to make my first draft, which worked like this. I have a parent element, obviously display flex wrap, because I want it to actually wrap around and everything. And then I had a multiplier in a custom property, which had that equation, which gave me a negative or positive value. I had a max width of 100% and a min width of 33.333, because I was dealing, to begin with just 3 items. So 3 items laid out horizontally or vertically. And then I use the multiplier, and then I multiply that by 999. So I get a very large positive number, or a very large or a very high in magnitude negative number. And what that does is this, is it drags the width in either direction, either up towards the very big number or down towards the very big negative number, and it'll hit these points where it won't be allowed to be anywhere else. So I've turned what's variable into either or. I've made it kind of Boolean. It will either be 33% or 100%. So that was kind of like the basic solution to the problem. In draft 2, I discovered that I was just being pretentious using custom properties. I didn't need those at all. And I decided to take that away and just do the calculation like this. So it's got a embedded bracket thing going on there. Actually, if I'm fair, do you know Jonathan Snook, who's a CSS person? He's very good at CSS. I published an article about the Flexbox Holy Albatross whilst still hungover, and it was gibberish. I mean, it had the solution in it, but it was very badly written. And then he wrote an article to explain what he thought was going on in my head. And then I read his article and I went, oh yeah, he's right, which is kind of weird. But so there's an article by him which sort of helps explain it as well. And he noticed that you didn't need to use custom properties. So this works in IE11 even, this container query thing, which is kind of cool. And then I discovered that someone called Remy Parmentier kind of already came up with this, and it's called the Fab4 technique. And I'd heard about the Fab4 technique, but I'd never actually done it. And it was kind of convergent evolution, because I was not aware that he'd done the same mathematical thing. I did do it separately, but he did come up with this before I did. So all credit to him for having come up to it before me. But then I wanted to iterate, because he wasn't actually using Flexbox. And Flexbox is a bit more powerful. The whole 33%, 100% max width, min width thing, you don't actually need to use Flexbox for that. But if you do use Flexbox, you can do some other quite cool things. So draft 3 deals with any number of children. So the idea is that you can have any number of horizontal switching to vertical children. And the way that works is I get rid of the min width and the max width. I turn on flex grow to 1, so that means every subject child flex element will grow to use up its allotted portion of the available space. And then I use flex basis to do the calculation bit. And what that means is flex basis will come out like as a very big negative number. And what happens there is interesting, because technically you're not allowed to have negative flex basis values. And I thought that would mean the declaration would just be dropped, but actually it seems to correct itself to 0. So you get these elements will grow from 0 to their allotted space. So in this case, a third of what's there. So that automatically works for you. And then of course a very high number, it will settle at 100%. It won't actually make it bigger than the container. So that works too. So what's great is I can just add another horizontal item. And now I've got 4 horizontal items, and at the same breakpoint, say 50 rem or whatever I've set, it will switch and go down into a vertical layout. And I can even put flex 2 on one of my items. So I'm using nth child 2 here to target the second of the 3 items in this case. And I can make that like a wide thing in the middle. And again, it's a horizontal layout or it's a vertical layout, doesn't use media queries. Draft 4, gutters. So in the diagrams, it looks like I've got margin in there, but that's just so you can actually see that they're individual elements. Actually, doing gutters is kind of tricky. Firefox supports something called gap. You may be aware of grid gap when you're using CSS grid, and what's cool about it is it just puts space between elements, and irrespective of what configuration they're in, so that's kind of handy. But gap, which will soon be supported in both Flexbox and Grid, is only so far supported like that in Firefox. So you can't do this in Chrome with Flexbox. But that soon will come. But in the meantime, we have to hack this together. So I have to put margin around all of the subject elements. And unfortunately, when I do that, even though the margin is then symmetrical, and when it wraps, it will behave kind of as I like, I still get the extra margins on the outside. So to fix that, I have to use a negative margin and pull that out in different directions like that. And that kind of fixes it. Then I have to make my container breakpoint actually still work where it's supposed to, I then have to adapt my calculation a little bit by removing the margin from that calculation. The reason being that because I'm stretching that element, it's now more than 100%. It's more than its container's natural width. And then because there's negative margins on the parent container, that means it's being pulled too far towards the element above or below it, and possibly elements to its side. And so you just need to have one more extra wrap around it, and that kind of suppresses the negativity like I try and do in my brain. Bonus, quantity queries. So you can also take another kind of look at it at another angle. So now we've got a breakpoint based on the available space, which says turn this horizontal layout into a vertical layout lower than 50 rem or 60 ch or 600 pixels or whatever it is. But what if we had loads of horizontal items? And the more we put in, obviously, the smaller amount of space each one can have. So we kind of want to have a limit to how many items are put in there as well. So display horizontally if there's more than 50 rem space and there are fewer than, let's say, 5 items. I wrote about quantity queries a while ago in 2015, the year that I was last at BTconf. And they kind of work like this. So there are 4 elements in the top example. So the n plus 5 elements, the nth last child n plus 5 elements, don't exist. There's not enough elements in total to be able to count back that far. So nothing happens, nothing is selected. These selectors at the top here don't match anything. However, if there's more than 4 items, n+5 elements do exist. They are selected, and when they are used in combination with the general sibling combinator, you can then use them to select all of the other elements there. That means you can use CSS to style elements based on how many there are, which is kind of handy in some cases, like in this case. So here I've got all of they're in a vertical configuration because nth last child n+5 exists, and there might be any number of these n+5 elements. But if they don't exist, then everything goes back into a horizontal configuration. What I'm doing overall here is kind of an algorithmic approach to layout. I am, instead of prescribing how things look and then re-prescribing how they look based on certain circumstances and kind of intervening manually by using at-media breakpoints and things like that, I'm teaching the layout to govern itself. I'm making it kind of autonomous. And I actually have done a video about this, a video introduction. I've started doing a video series called Making Future Interfaces. One of them is called Algorithmic Layouts. And I'm going to now play you an inspirational video I made, which is an introduction to this series. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go.
Previously on Making Future Interfaces.
It just works. Enhance.
Aha! Hoot!
Box. The C in CSS.
Everything's relative, man. Hi.
Blah, 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 blah. Disaster. The square, the fast square, the SAS and less.
Pixel perfection.
Rest in peace. Yeah. Boy. I think that's fairly self-explanatory, right? So I just took all of the stupid bits out of all the videos I've made so far and put them next to each other, obviously. Do you want to hear the theme tune at the end? Okay.
Browsers. Web pages. Hypertext. The word.
Yeah, so there you go. It's my friend Bobby Crisps on Twitter doing some of the voices in there. So yeah, if you want more of that sort of complete abject fucking nonsense, then go and check that out. In the meantime, custom elements. Why not? Let's talk about them. Let me just zoom in again. Custom elements. Okay, so I really like custom elements because they're really good for design systems. Because if I define something as a custom element, it's an interoperable native thing, so I can use it in all different tech stacks and whatever, like in Preact or Vue or what have you, which is kind of cool. You have to design them in a certain way for that to work. So this is what the Holy Albatross custom element, like a layout primitive element, might look like. I've got a switch prop or attribute and a margin one. And I set getters and setters for these inside the custom elements definition. And it kind of turns the element into an API. It makes it work like a native element, like just a basic semantic element like a button or something like that. And it means I can kind of connect it up into the outer application. So then when I put that into, say, a view application, it'll look like this. View uses this syntax with the colons, which kind of makes them live attributes, so I can pass down from the parent application information maybe about the layout or whatever. Or in Preact, you can do it like this. If you are transpiling stuff, then you need to have this custom elements ES5 adapter bit of script. Basically, it makes sure that the custom element itself isn't transpiled, because you can't transpile custom elements. You have to use progressive enhancement instead. Things that suck ass, number one. First of all, Shadow DOM. I really, really don't like Shadow DOM. I don't see the point of Shadow DOM. I really like custom elements, but I don't like Shadow DOM. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but in this case, it's one particular thing that kind of bothers me about trying to do these like layout components. So here's my shadow root. I create a shadow root on an element, and then I can do styling and HTML and stuff inside it, right? And then the stuff in the light DOM goes into a slot or a number of slots, but usually just a slot. And that slot's like a window back out into light DOM, right? And then inside the CSS in Shadow DOM, I can style the light DOM using... See, it already sounds stupidly complicated, doesn't it? But in any case, I can style those elements using the slotted special selectors. Unfortunately, they're very restrictive. Now, they kind of have to be for performance reasons, but basically, you can't do complex selection. You can't go down more than one nesting level, so you can't select the elements inside the slots, and you can't use combinators and things. So I can't actually do my my quantity query stuff, for instance, for my Flexbox thing. So I got rid of Shadow DOM, and I did something else instead. What I did, and it's sort of, I guess, CSS and JS libraries do something similar. What I did is I decided that I would take the values for each of my props for my Holy Albatross, turn them into a string, which is a unique identifier, and use that as an identifier for a style sheet. And I would then append that style sheet to the head of my document. So it's just normal embedded CSS, nothing to do with Shadow DOM. The cool thing, or maybe an efficiency thing, which is nice, is that it will only match if there's not already a style sheet which has that configuration, like that string, because the string is, of course, just made out of those values for my props. So the first albatross that is appended to the page will create the style tag, and then it will serve any other albatrosses with the same configuration, like with the same styling information. Or to put it another way, albatross! Like that, okay? So, and that's kind of what it looks like when you put the whole thing together. You've got your style sheet at the top, but then of course I use a data attribute to actually create the selector. And that works very well for me. But it does, of course, mean that I'm doing kind of a lot of DOM stuff, like on startup, to create the styles. So now for some initialisms. SSR with JS DOM, or server-side rendering with Jenga script document object model, which when you say it like that sounds really weird. But the idea is that I would do this on the server first if I was able to. Now JS DOM doesn't support custom elements, except in this specific fork of JS DOM. Now hopefully it will support it in the future, but T. Branyan has created a fork which supports custom elements. And now when I use my favorite static site generator, 11T, I can do I can add a transform, and what that does is, so in your 11T setup, you would have maybe some markdown files, not necessarily, but you'd probably start with markdown files with some front matter and stuff, and then that would get converted into HTML via a templating language like Nunchucks, or actually supports loads of different templating languages. And then you can actually take that and kind of post-process that HTML, which is where you can stick in JS DOM and actually manipulate that HTML string like it's an actual DOM. And there, just with that amount of text there, I can create the Holy Albatross as a server-rendered layout component. So actually, I can effectively just get rid of JavaScript. This is no longer actually something which needs to do anything on the client at all, unless you actually adapt one of the props and give it a different value. Then, of course, it would have to re-render. But that's much more efficient, I think. Things that suck ass. Number 2 is, controversial one slightly maybe, React sucks ass. And the reason React sucks ass is it's not very good at supporting custom elements. You'd think that React would support HTML, but it doesn't apparently, because custom elements are made using the HTML element class primitive thing. And Vue is very good at handling that. It can pass events in and out of it very nicely, and complex data and that kind of thing. And so is Preact, apart from the transpilation issue and all of that. React is not very good at that at all. But I appreciate that a lot of people use React and are quite fond of React, and I don't want to upset anyone. So in the interest of balance, I'm just going to say hooks and hooks, 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 hooks. Finally, some comments. So I wrote about this Holy Albatross thing on the interwebs, and I tend to get some interesting comments from people who like or perhaps don't like what I'm writing about, and they have very strong opinions about it. One I got here was, seriously, you prefer to use this solution instead of a simple media query? Yes, Patrick, you starfish fuck. I did decide, and I've explained now, hopefully everyone will understand why I went in that route, because of the design system thing and all of that stuff. That's why container queries are good, etc., etc. This was followed up by someone called Lars Fay, who's making the assertion that I'm probably the sort of person, based on my writing, that is either extremely bored, narcissistic, or a sadist. I think you'd have to have lived kind of a sheltered life to think that some writing about CSS that you don't particularly want to make use of, that you're reading for fucking free, is being a sadist. But there you go. But I did get some positive comments as well. There was some lovely stuff in there. There's this one from Mark, who says, love this, no punctuation, recommend myschooltutorial.com. And what Mark is doing there is he's being really helpful. He's saying, I like what you've written here. I also have similar interests, and there happens to be this website that covers these sorts of topics. And if you want to learn more, I'm an expert in that area. So if you have any questions about algorithmic layout and holy albatrosses and that sort of stuff, get yourself over to My School Tutorial, where you'll find some awesome e-learning. And there's the internet address there in order to do that. Thank you very much for listening to me today.